Hello. Welcome to Nos Héritages. I'm so glad to have you here because your thoughts on cultural production and the way that they can bring our communities together are so important and so interesting. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, and thank you for the kindness of the invitation.
My pleasure. First, can you introduce yourself?
Yes.
And your professional practices.
Sure. My name is Mi'Jan Celie Tho-Biaz, and I say to people, if you can think of two things coming together, then you understand everything that I do. So I am a cultural worker, which is a broad term, and it just means that I have studied, and the work that I do all falls under cultural production, cultural strategy, cultural storytelling, cultural research, cultural teaching, and then cultural productions of events, live events. The way that I particularly practice, though, is through oral history. So not just the process of collecting and archiving and amplifying stories from a past event or a historical time, but also the products of that process and that practice. So my most favorite thing to do is collaborate with great, incredible contemporary cultural workers and artists. And for me, that means working with muralists who take those oral histories and create large-scale murals, working with DJs who take some of the edited oral histories and they put it together with music, working with chefs. I love working with chefs because I'm a foodie. I love food. Who doesn't love food? And doing something that I call story feast suppers. Sometimes working with media professionals and working on public radio. The sky's the limit in terms of what we can do with oral histories, at least to my thinking. So that's just a bit about what I do.
You mentioned culture a lot. And the main goal of Nos Héritages is to document the stories of our parents and grandparents who migrated from Africa, Asia, South America to Europe. So on here we talk about our cultural backgrounds. Can you tell us about yours?
I identify as Black American. Some people say African American. I grew up in a time where we were Black, so I still say I'm Black American. That said, especially for people who haven't lived in the United States, Black America is a very nuanced, multicultural experience and identity. And so I add the further detail of I am Black American from Chicago, the Midwest, soul food, jazz, gospel. And then as an adult, I moved to New Orleans, Louisiana, which, my God, the food there, the music there, it's equally vibrant. However, the richness, I feel like, is on display in the public streets through carnival, parade, what is called Mardi Gras. That's so wild. I was going to say, in the way that those two places taste are very different. Even though both groups of people are Black American, there's this complexity of the seafood in New Orleans and the spiciness it's one of my favorite places in the world, and I'm happy that I started growing up as an adult there. So I'm Black American.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I felt like you took me there, like I traveled there I've never been there, but I felt like I was.
You should go to both places.
I will. So first I'd like to talk about the importance of telling stories. I feel like working in the culture field means, occupying a position of power. The power to decide which stories we are going to recount and share about the world and its peoples, and also the stories that we are not going to recount and and share. It's also the power to decide the ways in which we narrate those stories and who is going to tell them. And so when we tell our stories, I feel, and especially the stories of our communities, I feel like we have a responsibility. What are your thoughts about that?
I agree 1,000,000%. The way that I was trained by an organization called the Voice of Witness is to center and honor first-person stories. So not me telling your story, me creating oral history questions that first and foremost honor you, your stories, who you come from, and those memories. I feel like that's one of the first things that I should say. To your point about which stories we tell or help facilitate in the telling and which stories we don't, I never come up with those parameters outside of ethics, ethical considerations. I ask the communities who have invited me to do the projects of oral history and to collaborate and how they will be amplified and archived. Everything has to come from the community, not from me, because I'm not the expert. I can have expertise in oral history, the practice of it, creating the projects. However, I'm not the expert of those stories or that community. So all of that has to come from them. That's how I orient myself to the projects and to oral history in general. Yeah.
And I was listening to one of your talks, and you said something I found really relevant and beautiful. I quote, "I want to see stories that honor the past while making meaning of the present and envisioning liberated and loving futures." I don't want just one, I want all of that. I was listening to your talk and doing, I don't remember what, at the same time, and when you said that, I was like, oh, that's it, like, yes. Can you explain further what you meant by that? Like, how can we do all of that?
Slowly, carefully. And usually with learning embedded in it, I think, again, it's not, or I can say it in the affirmative, it's always with. In terms of honoring the past, for me, that starts with how I design every single oral history interview and more larger and broadly the project. So I have learned somewhere in the first 2, 3, 4 years of the work, and I think I've been practicing for about 14 years, to ask, what are your cultural protocols? Who is the very first person, or what is the very first thing that I have to do as an outsider coming in, even if I look like you, but I'm still more than likely an outsider to your community? Who's the first person I need to talk to? And I feel like even in answering this, I should honor the first organization that made me very aware of this, Tewa Women United. It's the Intertribal Women's Indigenous Organization for the state of New Mexico. And in their case, when they first encountered me in my work, they said, "We love what you do, and we're curious, could you do some story work with us?" And I said, "I would love to, but I'm so unfamiliar. I'm not from your communities, your tribes in New Mexico, and I don't know how to engage or even just conceive of a large-scale project," especially because they were saying, we're thinking about the last 30 years, our genesis of this intertribal work, as we are envisioning the next 30 years, because all their work follows this value that everything must be intergenerational, and that it's not about this moment of today only. And so I said, okay, I'm going to come up with some ideas. You're saying some words, some prayers, some cultural ways, they can't even be discussed or recorded outside of that tribe. And they said, yes, what would you do with that? And I'm like, I don't know. I'm not from your communities. So the only thing I can think of, and when we're talking about stories of the past and we're trying to do it in an honorable way, what else do you have as a cultural tradition across these tribes that does just that? And I'm not talking about stories, I'm just saying, is there some other practice that we can sort of connect with? And they said, yes, we do seed exchange. So seeds from the ground to grow plants, herbs, flowers, etc. And I said, okay, well, what do you do when you're exchanging? Are there some seeds that you need to keep in your tribe? Are there some seeds that it's totally fine to exchange? She said, yes. And I said, okay, well, what are cultural protocols that you follow? And maybe there's a way we can do this story, oral history kind of work that honors in the exact same ways the exchange process. And I said, great, okay, wonderful. And then the second thing they said was, well, but you should talk to our elders. And I was like, okay, can you tell me a little more? Why? And they said, you should actually ask for permission. And it's the first time that I had an organization, a group, say, you know what? Before you move into the community and do this work, here's the very first step to take with the very first person. And so they have an indigenous sort of grandmothers group of elder women who come together, and one is one of the co-founders of this intertribal group and organization. And I collected her oral history, and I feel like it was the first time that I learned in my practice, if I'm going to touch in an honorable way stories of the past, I probably should always talk to, or at least try to talk to, people who actually remember and have been holding the responsibility for multiple decades, because that experience and those stories are, as a consequence, the largest set. It's always important to honor and to include young people too, because they have a different perspective. They're looking at the future. And so I was like, okay, great. I think I've got something that speaks to honoring the past. Always start with the elders. In the present, what I'm learning is it's who I collaborate with. They're always going to be my greatest source of helping me engage in this present moment. And so it's not that I get in trouble, it's where I'm a non-traditional oral historian, because I say everything that we do that's honoring these past stories, when we're amplifying it, usually no one says, oh, I'm going to wave a flag here and you're doing something that's cutting edge or different or non-traditional. When I say this is how we're going to amplify these stories, sure, fine. This is how we're going to archive them. If it's ephemeral, meaning it's not going to last potentially for hundreds of years into the future. If I choose methods and collaborators who work in ephemeral ways, that's usually when people say, wait, is that really legitimate? And I say, well, our goal, my goal in my practice, our goal in these projects, our goals that overlap with these communities is loving and liberated futures. I don't know that it has to be archived in ways that you can touch forever. I'm more curious about, and I'm more committed to, ways that will meet people where they are in their communities and be significant to them, not the other way around, to traditional institutions, to funders, and I make sure that I get everybody on board with it before I progress. However, if the most important thing is the value and the essence of loving and liberated futures, let that be the North Star or the South Star that is our guiding force in our choices.
Thank you. This is very powerful and interesting, and especially the last part about archiving, because, you know, growing up in Europe and maybe in, you know, North America too, society tells us that we have to, you know, write or to, you know, archive, to, you know, have museums. And so we feel like, okay, but oral tradition is not enough. And so you completely changed that mindset. And how do you make sure that those documents, those archives are accessible to everybody in the community, even like more vulnerable people, for example?
I don't. I don't have all of the answers. There's no way for me possibly to, even if that was something that I, aspired to.
Yeah.
That's where the people who I collaborate with and hire through the project, they have the better answers that are more significant and meaningful than I do. And I ask the community, okay, where are the places that people pass every day without having to show identification? Because that is one of the issues with archives, traditional archives. If it's in a repository at a university or a government building, and again, I am starting to actually understand and contextualize differently, and I understand the importance of archives now, the traditional ones, so I'm not saying that they are bad. I'm not putting a judgment on them. What I do want to say, though, is if the community is undocumented, meaning they don't have a passport or they don't have that country's driver's license, some sort of identification card, if we do an entire story project and it's community-based, and then we archive those stories in government or university institutions that require documentation, then it's not going to be accessible. And so it still could live there. That's up for debate. However, it's my job to ensure that the places that this community goes back and forth in front of, that's where murals are so important, because even though they're ephemeral and they will not last perhaps beyond a couple of decades, like 20 years, maybe 10 years, it depends. The funding, they may be able to retouch it and it can keep going. However, even if the mural fades, it's the place where children will pass, elders will pass. It might be on your way to your grocery store. Another thing that I've learned is public libraries. So this is where, fine, it's not in a book, it's not in a journal series. However, if in my job, I can record them and put them in terms of transcripts in writing and put those in a library alongside audio of the oral histories, that's another place where people can encounter them. If I can collaborate with chefs and do events, people can not just hear the stories in real, active, present day time, but they can also taste some of the recipes that people are describing from their family traditions. When I get an opportunity to collaborate with journalists, the audio can go through the internet, social media. So that's why it's always important to ask communities, where are the places that people touch every day, hear every day, see every day, taste, like go through the different senses. And then that's how I come together with a short list of possible collaborators. And from those collaborators who have their individual expertise or multiple expertises, they say, these are the ways that we can amplify and archive.
You mentioned public institutions. I feel like cultural institutions such as theaters and museums are not always designed for us in ways that will make us feel good there. For example, in the theater, like sitting for 2, maybe 3 hours without, talking. This is not in our African cultures where we like to, speak loudly, to react to what is happening, to applaud, etc., etc. And museums, they take or they steal objects from our cultures and display them without, context or a critical analysis. How can we reinvent new spaces, that can archive our stories, but more than that, that can, respect us too?
I think there are great examples that I have actually seen in communities. So I'll give two examples that really, wow, I want to visit or I have visited. One that I want to visit is in Chicago, my hometown. There is an amazing artist, and his sort of, I don't want to try to even describe in exact words, but I'll just say how I receive his artwork is in public spaces, and his name is Theaster Gates. And he has an archive that his organization has, and I think it's called Rebuild Foundation, has created by reclaiming an old abandoned bank. So beautiful building, but seems like it may have been dilapidated. I think the story is he bought it for $1.
Oh.
However, with the requirement of really with careful detail, and I suppose the appropriate architects to rebuild it so that it would be safe, but also honor its past and make it a contemporary space that holds the archive of a house music DJ. I think it's Frankie Knuckles. So there are records, vinyl records there, as well as the Johnson Publishing Company was a Black publishing company. I remember growing up, and it was definitely established before I grew up in the 80s, of the Ebony Jet, I think, magazines. Essence is still going, but Ebony Jet. And so you can go there and apparently, because I haven't gone yet, but it's on my future list, you can go and see these magazines that I believe would have perished without the appropriate space and support. And so what do they do in this Stony Island Art Bank? Do not quote me, but I think that's what it's called. They have block parties as part of Rebuild Foundation. So there's music, there's food. Everybody from the community is welcome. They have listening experiences. They have artist talks. So there is a way of reclaiming spaces that honor the stories and function as archives in contemporary ways that feel so good to us, that allow, I think what you're alluding to is this notion of call and response. So not a museum or a cultural institution talking at you, not a theater production forcing you to listen and listen only for 3 hours, regardless of the range of emotions that maybe are strongly elicited. There's an opportunity, there's interplay. And that's what I value too, not just as a cultural producer, but also just as that kind of a learner, that kind of a listener. I love and I enjoy more exchange than someone talking at me or performing at me or exhibiting at me. Yeah,
precisely. And so back at, the importance of telling stories. So the goal of Nos Héritages is to document the stories of our parents, grandparents. It is also to ensure the transmission between generations, but also between and within our communities. And the idea behind this podcast was also to create a safe space so that people could tell their stories, and feel safe while doing it. And I have been doing this for a few years now, collecting our stories. And a lot of similar projects have been developed in recent years in Belgium and in France. And it feels so good being able to, discover or rediscover our stories and to relate to books, movies, podcasts. But now I am at a stage where I'm like, okay, and now what? Like, what is next, Because I feel like the stories are important, but they don't really have much of an impact on the society we live in, They don't really change it. And so my question is, like, how can we create stories that can actually transform the reality we live in? How do we make an impact and maybe politicize our stories?
I think it goes back to this notion of who you can collaborate with, who already are moving and transforming the spaces that you now seek for the future. So a question I guess I have for you is, who is already working and feels compelled and passionate in the, maybe not exact, but complementary ways as you, who's already received respect, but more importantly, I feel like trust from the communities that you're working with, who is effectively building policy that is having a positive social change today? I think that's question number one. Another way, and I do believe in social media as an extremely potent tool. It's not something that it's not under my wheelhouse of skills. I always collaborate with someone who does that very well. Usually they're much younger than me. I would be curious about other collaborations that you could do. And I don't know if this is going to land or not well with you, but with cultural institutions right now that have the audience and have said, you know what, we have maybe not done the best job in the past. However, we have the audience and we have the ears and the pockets of funders. We want to do public programming well moving forward. This is invisible work that the public has not seen, but I would be willing to bet so much if there's somebody in the education department as well as public programming department who says, gosh, you know, we've got an exhibition coming up in 2025, 2026. Is there a way that we can be even more respectful as we're working with migrant communities, immigrant communities, refugees? We have an artist who's coming in. If you can link up with the artist and those departments, I wonder what magic could happen there. And then my third thing that just comes to mind when you were talking about changing and shifting policies, and again, it can be tricky, I'm not going to lie. Is there a politician who maybe they're not at the highest level, and I don't mean to say this from a hierarchical perspective, but a local politician who has garnered enough, again, not, yes, respect, but trust. Is there a politician who you could say, you know what, let's begin working on a relationship, an explicit relationship? Doesn't necessarily have to be a public relationship, but a relationship nonetheless. These stories are important because they're coming from our people and they're first person. They're not forced, they're not coerced. This is what they're saying that matters to them in vulnerable moments. And we're wondering what work could happen between government and this private initiative. That's another thought that I have.
So yeah, once again, it's not about doing the work by yourself. It's about community and finding allies. And,
100%. And I would say, and if possible, and I don't have another word for it, but using the stories as an entry point to the work. So people, I've learned over these years, a lot of times people, actually, I want to say, one policy institution in the United States that hired me, commissioned me to do a large body of work, one of the very most memorable things that I remember from that initial meeting was they said, the world doesn't really need another white paper, another report, because so many people with their expertise can work on those white papers, those reports, and community members, many times unpaid, will contribute to those reports, and then not no one, but very small numbers of people, and generally not in the communities that are being highlighted in these reports, we'll read them, we'll even encounter them, or we'll read them to completion, because that's a whole other different, very smaller percentage of people. And they said, what would you do if we could actually commission you to create a story project, and instead of starting policy meetings with a report, if we could press play and listen to the stories instead of reading? And I said, you know what? Do you want to know how honorable that is, and how much more resonance there is, not just for the people who are coming to their millionth meeting, right? And and encountering something that's written, but just as you started at the very beginning, and we were talking about even before recording, so many people come from cultures that have all of their wisdom passed orally.
Yeah.
And so it's like, yes, why wouldn't you honor them and those stories in a way that is authentic and to this day practiced? Wow, how wonderful. So.
Yeah. And another topic I'd like to talk about is representation. Representation seems to have become, a central issue in movements for a more egalitarian, diverse society. But what does representation mean to you? Is it important when, crafting our stories?
I approach it a bit differently. My goal is not representation. My goal is collaborative work. And so for me, that means finding the foundation, the funding partner that has not representation, but reflection in executive leadership, all the way through to the program officer. It means the commissioning entity for my work also reflects the community. Everything is going to flow so much better when that is the case, and we're working in an equitable table and stance, as opposed to me having to beg, please give me money so I can do this project. Please work with me so this project can go forward. If I'm working with people who are reflecting the community in sometimes invisible ways, but hopefully also in very visible ways, it's a completely different project. The need around it, I don't have to make a PowerPoint presentation to, actually I'm just coming to understand. Yes, so give me a moment to let me explain this. I have learned in my practice, whenever I feel like, or if I don't want to say being made to feel, but whenever this comes up in a meeting and someone says, we'd like you to do this work, if I feel like I have to justify, I know that I'm working with someone who is moving from a place of representation versus reflection. If I feel like, and my perception is, oh, there's further explanation that's being required so that this person understands, that's a different story, totally different story. But justifying, I know there's some judgment there, and that this person is probably further removed from the communities that I'm working with.
Yeah. So you don't feel like, because I feel like the issue of representation is, like it's a responsibility that we have towards our community in some sort of way, or reflecting. But it's also a weight put on our shoulders by society.
Yeah.
For example, if we express ourselves as women of color, society will consider that we are speaking on behalf of every racialized women, and this is not the case for everybody, especially for white people, white men, who can, express and only represent themselves. And so I'm sometimes caught between the two. On the one hand, we are educated to feel responsible for representing our communities, but on the other hand, it is a weight that should not be heavy on our shoulders. How do you feel about that?
Oh my gosh, what a big question.
Yeah, no.
I feel so many things. I mean, and also it depends on where I am professionally and personally. I'm a mother. Both of my children are in their 20s. They're adults, and have lived here in Europe. Both of them lived and studied in Europe.
Okay.
And I try to remember constantly I'm in this sandwich generation. So the elders who I grew up with had very different responsibilities and challenges that were sometimes violent, physical harm. I'm thinking about my parents being young adults in the 1960s, and then their grandparents. And I think especially because my dad yes, we figured it out, probably from that last generation in the United States that would live either on the East Coast, the Midwest, or the West Coast, and they would go down south to the southern states where, family members were, so that they could remain connected, for a larger family, but also to understand how life was for many. So that was his generation, and a story he would always talk about is leaving Kansas City, Missouri, and I forgot what state line it was, where, I don't know why it just made me emotional. Well, because he would tell it and he would get emotional sometimes, where he would have to get off the train because it was going further south and go sit in the back, regardless of whatever ticket they purchased, sit in the back. And then continue the rest of the journey down south. And I realized in my generation, and I don't know if there will be a resurgence depending on the outcome of this upcoming federal election, perhaps might influence it. My generation, there still was this, not going down south to these southern states in the summer, but understanding the importance of going to what's called an HBCU, an historic Black college or university. And I did. I went to an HBCU. I'm an HBCU alum. And so it was an opportunity in my case to go live in the South. That's how I went to New Orleans for 4 years. And I realized with my children, though, that generation, my children didn't go to the South in the summer, and neither of them went to an HBCU. Had an opportunity to study in Europe, went to, fancy great schools. Not to say that HBCUs are not fancy or great, because they definitely are. And a different experience, though. And so I say and I share all of that to explain that I understand my parents and that generation to have lived through covert and overt racism differently than my generation and my children's generation. Do I believe that racism exists and oppression and this, so long way of saying, this responsibility of being the representation? Do I believe that there's a common thread? Yes. How it showed up and how it shows up in the different generations is different, though.
Yeah.
And one thing I think about and I reflect on is, my parents and thank God, my grandmother, I would be at her home every single Sunday. And I recognized that they had, just more overt racism and the ways, actually, I want to answer it this way. The ways that they moved through the world and held that responsibility, unfortunately, I can see now, came with tremendous cost to their lifespan. So in our family, no one lives until their 90s or 100. No, all dead in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and thank God my dad lived to be 79. He didn't make it to 80. And it's something that I'm aware of, that everything has a cost. And even though I am 1,000,000% committed to the work and the communities who I get an opportunity to work with, I know that that cost can come with a price tag of my physical health, my mental well-being, my emotional well-being, and also how many years on the planet that I can continue to do that work. And so I'm still in my late 40s, and I think now's the time where I better be very considerate of myself if I want to continue to do this work. Yes, there's a dance, and sometimes it's going to look different, but being a good, I don't even like the word representative, but being a good relative to the people who are also women of color, families of color, people of color, it better not, in my generation, it better not come at the high price of dying in the next decade of my life.
Thank you so much for sharing a part of your story and your thoughts. And I feel like, it's so important that we learn to take care of us, like individually, but also collectively.
That's right.
That is so important. And so we talked about what you do to collecting stories like with other communities, but have you done it like with your family?
Yes. Yeah. But you just made me realize I should do it with my children. When my dad had multiple terminal illnesses diagnosed, and also his physician pulled me to the side and said, for sure, he has dementia. I said, okay, he's the storyteller of our family. I need to start recording his stories. And so on Sundays, at first he resisted me. He said, no, I don't want to do it. And I'm like, how? You had a whole career in media, with television, radio, what? But I understood that there was a fair degree of grief there, that he knew, it was that phase, he knew that he was losing his memories. And so, but me being stubborn, I said, well, if I bring my daughter every Sunday and she does it, because she would come to visit, but she would be off doing all kinds of things while she was at his house, watching television, cleaning up sometimes, helping to get the meals together. And I said, but if she's the one who records, he's not going to tell her no. And true enough, that was the case, but he was still resistant. And so the advice that I now offer is, if people in their families can begin that process before maybe a traumatic thing that could be on the horizon, God forbid, however, maybe that is the case, before, a family member who's older experiences memory decline or illness and makes it challenging. Also, another thing that I'm learning is, if the stories that at least we begin to record, and even without recording, but tell and retell at the family dinner table around joyous celebrations, and so they elicit these stories that are very joyful and proud moments. If we can start there and make sure that that's woven throughout, generally people are not shy in our family. And now what you just sort of inspired in me is, and if we can ask our young people, so not just the elders, but the young people, and the thing that I've been the most curious about recently is also, especially for the women in our family, can you tell me the stories of rest? Like, how do you rest? How do our mothers rest? How did our grandmothers rest?
That's a question I ask very often to people I meet, because I can't rest. I'm always working and thinking about that, so it's a very important question. And so how do you rest?
Oh gosh. I am on the go a lot. However, I intentionally build in rest times in my week as well as with trips. And so one of the things that I love to do is share rest, because then that sort of influences me in actually doing that. My great wonderful, amazing daughter and son, I rest with food, believe it or not, because if it's a long, luxurious meal and people aren't just really quickly, eating, it gives an opportunity for us to crack jokes and to reflect on trips or big moments in life, as well as to catch up over the smaller things. Another thing that I love so much, like when I'm in Los Angeles, there's a part of the city that's called Koreatown, and there are these Korean spas, and it's one of my favorite things to do is to go with my girlfriends, and now it's even extended, like I have this dear sister friend, Donna, and actually that was wild. I love so much her mother, and now her grandmother has passed away, and we all came together, this must have been, I don't know, maybe 2 years ago or so, and it was on the anniversary of her grandmother's passing, and I didn't put the two things together. And I said, really, should we do this? I feel badly, or maybe you should have this alone. And they said, no, she would have loved this. She would have loved for us to be together. And yes, there were tender moments, and it was sad, quite sad for her mother and also for Donna, but it was also such a sweet thing to spend several hours together being pampered and being able to take a nap, because I did fall asleep at a certain point, and getting massages. And I mean, it's like rest doesn't have to be that elaborate. What I think about is the memory, and I just wrote about this recently, of being a girl, and I still to this day have no idea what my mother was doing in the bathroom for what seemed like so long. But she had a weekly bathtub time on the weekend, and as children, we were not allowed. If somebody could have broken a bone, it does not matter. You needed to be quiet. You had to feed yourself, and I think it was like an hour or two. You could not knock on this woman's door. The phone could ring. Do not disturb her. What it taught me was, because she was so hardworking, going and growing professionally in her life, that what she modeled was that no matter how busy she was, being a mother, being a strong worker, showing up for family, she deserved, even if it was just 1 hour, her own private time to rest. Like I said, I think it was rest. I have no idea if she was like writing to a pen pal. Who knows?
But amen to that. She must have that time. It's so important.
And privately.
And an hour is not that big, that much.
Out of 7 days,
Yeah.
24 hours each day. Are
Yeah.
you kidding me? If you don't have 1 hour to yourself, come on.
Yeah. So today we discussed what you received as cultural heritage a little bit. And to close the episode, I would like to ask you a question, because it's like a little ritual we have at Nos Héritages. So my last question is, what would you like to leave as a legacy?
Oh, God.
Yeah, I know.
Keep asking these big questions. Oh.
I'm so glad I'm the one asking questions and not
Yes.
answering it.
Not fair. I don't. That just like made me tear up, because I've been thinking about that consistently for the last year since my dad passed away, and I don't have that answer precisely. I can just answer it by saying, I always think of my children, and it's never going to be what I said to them. I guarantee it's going to be how I loved them. Mm-hmm. I think that would probably be the legacy. And then all of the community members and communities who I've had an opportunity to work with and alongside and collaborate, I guarantee that how they felt in those collaborations will be the things that they remember too.
Well, that's a perfect way to end this episode. Thank you so much. It was so powerful, so interesting.
This was an honor and a pleasure. Thank you.
Pleasure's all mine. Thank you so much.